In this session, we're going to be focusing more on the actual mission work in the Restoration Movement, the Stone Campbell movement, and thinking about the different areas that missionaries were sent, a little bit about some missionaries, not too many specifically by name, some of the challenges that Restoration Movement missionaries faced, and just kind of a very broad scale. We'll look predominantly at region, mention a couple specific countries, but just kind of trying to do a flyover of the different efforts. In so doing, we're just going to predominantly focus on works by the Churches of Christ and the disciples. The independent Christian churches were active as well, and I don't want to say that they should be ignored, but again, just trying to do a broad overview. As we mentioned in the previous session, of course, mission at work has been a very important part of the Restoration Movement, and is reflective in a lot of activity by people within the Restoration Movement and its heritage in the Churches of Christ, especially today, and the independent Christian churches today. A little bit different for the disciples, as we mentioned, much more of an ecumenical focus, and certainly the disciples being involved more in social activity alongside that mission work, or predominantly focusing their mission work on social activity and not as much on evangelism as might be the case with the Churches of Christ in the independent Christian churches. In many respects, since this is a movement that starts in the 19th century, it's starting just as there is that renewed interest in missionary work from a Protestant standpoint that is really starting to take off. And the Restoration Movement is, in some sense, late to the game compared to some other religious groups, and it's not until you start seeing in the 50s, 1850s, the Restoration Movement starting to be involved specifically in overseas missions. To some extent, some of those early places were places where there were already members of denominations, where there were denominations active, and so some of that was an attempt to try and draw people away from those denominations. But eventually there is an effort to start foreign missions in lands where that are predominantly non-Christian. So we'll look at a variety of regions here and cover some efforts by the Restoration Movement missionaries. Let's start with Africa. Remember that Africa is really a bigger mission field in the 20th century than the 19th century, although some preliminary efforts are made in the 19th century in Africa. It's not, though, until the 20th century when there is such an explosion of conversions and churches and mission efforts that really impacts Africa. Let's look, though, at the disciples' work. First, we already noted that one of the first missionaries to Africa from the Restoration Movement was a freed slave named Alexander Cross, who goes to Liberia in 1854. Cross was born sometime around 1811, is the best estimate of historians. He was a slave when the vice president of the American Christian Missionary Society happened to hear him speak on temperance. Did some preaching as well, and so he hears him preaching about temperance. Temperance, of course, related to not drinking alcohol, a very important social issue in the 19th century. And so this vice president, David Burnett, hears Cross speak and is convinced that he needs to be very active, and that what would really be useful is for him to be a missionary to Liberia. Now, Liberia as a country is still relatively new at this time, and it had been created partly through work through the United States with the intention of a lot of people who supported the idea of colonization of freed slaves. So the northern opponents of slavery, a lot of them were colonizers, colonizationists, and so they thought that what should happen is the slaves should be freed and sent back to Africa, even though by this point in history a lot of these people that are enslaved didn't grow up in Africa. They weren't born in Africa. But the notion was we'll send the slaves back to Africa. And so Liberia was created as a country that colonized slaves could be sent to. And so the idea was let's free Cross, and we'll send him back to Liberia. We'll send him to Liberia. And so Burnett encourages a variety of churches to purchase his freedom, which they do, and he is sent to Liberia as a missionary. As I mentioned in previous session, though, the efforts in Liberia end pretty quickly. Cross dies just a few months after getting to Liberia. I think it's only like 2 months. And so he dies in 1854, and that essentially ends the mission work to Africa for quite some time. It'll be later that it'll be picked up, and actually, it's like 40 years later, in the later part of the 19th century. There would be other efforts in the later 19th century, first to Congo in 1885 and to Nigeria in 1895. The Congo mission ended because of the finances required. Many of these other missions ended fairly quickly. The first fairly successful work began in Congo 12 years after that first mission. So the first mission starts, it ends pretty quickly. Toward the end of the 19th century, the disciples try again. It is a more successful work, a longer lasting work, predominantly because there is greater cooperation with African Christians and the missionaries that are coming. There were some challenges that the disciples had coming into mission work in Congo. Presbyterian and Baptist missionaries there have been protesting some human rights abuses by the government. And the state and the government was reluctant to let new missionaries in. So even though the disciples weren't affiliated with the Presbyterians or Baptists, there was still this opposition to new missionaries because of the protesting that was going on. Congo remained a focus of the disciples even into the 20th century. They would be involved in other countries as well, but there was a lot of effort in Congo. Missionaries worked on creating teaching materials, preaching, but also then opening schools and hospitals. A lot of the converts and the nationals in Congo became involved fairly early on in evangelizing. Essentially, the missionaries kind of let the Congolese Christians do much of the evangelism work. They were helping, but they were kind of letting them do a lot of the work. When Congo gained its independence from colonial powers, the church leaders began to assert more authority, and the missionaries were kind of considered their partners, right? So they're the ones that are really doing the effort, and you can help us instead of you being kind of in charge and we'll help you. So there's a shift as well in power between the church leaders and the missionaries that take place after this. Disciples also get involved in the creation of the Protestant University of Congo, suggesting this more ecumenical focus of the disciples on the mission field. in the idea of them helping out this other university. When it comes to the Churches of Christ, one of the first missionaries to Africa came from New Zealand. His name was John Sheriff. So it is not Americans or British, or specifically from Britain, but from New Zealand. Sheriff went to South Africa, eventually working in the country of Rhodesia. Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. And he essentially goes there and is a tent maker. Well, he's a stonemason. I mean, tent maker in the sense of he works to support himself, like Paul does. So Sheriff uses his stone cutting abilities to support himself while also evangelizing. Eventually, he would make some appeals and would get missionaries from the United States and elsewhere to come and help in the mission work. The work in Africa essentially went through three phases throughout the 19th and 20th century. The first stage, or the first phase, was the mission station phase. Things that we've seen already, like with Carey, with the Judsons, with other missionaries we've looked at. You create this mission station that is kind of an encampment, and then from there you go out and go to other places. And so a lot of the focus is on the mission. That's where the home base is. Sheriff represents that first stage. He began a mission station in Cape Town, South Africa. He would later go on to create one in Rhodesia. Essentially, a lot of the mission was on evangelism, right? So planting churches. There's some school work, creating schools, education, most of them night classes. But then also creating a system to train national evangelists. Right? So kind of a preacher training school for people of the country. He would later encourage a variety of other missionaries to establish mission stations in Zambia, Malawi, as well as others in Zimbabwe. The second phase, the institution building phase, was focused more on institutions like schools, hospitals. I mean, Sheriff had done some things with schools, but these are even grander institutions of what he established. This brought missionaries into Nigeria, Tanzania, Botswana, in an expansion of creating schools that were more colleges, higher education, along with hospitals. One of the converts from South Africa in this phase was a man named Abraham Malherbe. Malherbe is he passed away a couple years ago. He was a famous New Testament scholar who taught at Yale Divinity School. Member of the Churches of Christ. So Malherbe is converted in the second wave of mission work. He will eventually make it to the United States, and he gets education, becomes a scholar in the New Testament, well known even outside of the Churches of Christ. Focusing a lot on the social world, the social situation of early Christianity. And as I mentioned, just passed away. It's probably 5 or 6 years ago now, but is part of this effort. In this second phase, the work would continue to expand into Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia. The third wave, the contextualizing missions wave, started in the 1970s, and just like other mission efforts that were focusing on contextualized missions, there's more of this trying to establish ethnic churches, that are as fully indigenous as possible. The goal is not to convert people to Christianity and Western culture. It's having a lot of customs related to the indigenous people, dress, etc. And so less about making them Western in addition to Christians. And so there's a lot more focus on that. And a lot of that has to do with a general trend, a general shift that's taking place in missiology, largely in Christianity, but then also kind of churches of Christ adopting that as well.